Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, I introduce you to experts across the state in all different kinds of topics. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope this show is something that you look forward to every week and it inspires you. And we're heading into a new year. Seed planting time is getting closer and closer. So you're going to want to stay tuned to Gardening Utah because we are going to keep you in the know on everything you need to do to get your seeds started, whether it's flowers, whether it's vegetables, no matter what it is. Stay with Gardening Utah all year and we're going to give you the best yard in the neighborhood. All you need to do is implement our tips and tricks. Okay, so listen, episodes drop every weekend on both Apple Podcast and Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. And by the way, did you hear me say Spotify? Yes, it's true. If you're listening to this on KKAT 860 AM, you can now also download our podcast on Spotify. So just bring out Spotify, go to Gardening Utah or search Gardening Utah, and you will find all of our episodes there. This is episode 34, and you can binge listen to all the past episodes. And boy, do we have some amazing past episodes. Okay, so that's announcement number one. And here's announcement number two. If you have an Alexa, now I'm spelling that out because I don't want mine to start talking while I'm recording this show. But if you have an Alexa, you can ask her to play Gardening Utah. So all you need to do is say, Alexa, play the podcast Gardening Utah. So again, just say, play the podcast Gardening Utah, and off you go. It will play the latest episode, and there you have it. So there's another tip. Oh, speaking of tips, it's time for the tip of the week.
860 KKAT. With your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is your evergreens and other trees or shrubs in your yard, especially newly planted ones, need water now. And you may think it's the middle of winter. Why do we need to go out and water our evergreens? And by the way, I have talked about this recently in past episodes in the tip of the week, but I was motivated to say it again because we have had so little moisture in Utah this winter. And really, especially broadleaf evergreens or anything newly planted, they're really going to struggle because of the lack of humidity and the freeze-thaw issue. And a lot of times, if you think about it, plants will still lose water through desiccation, whether they have leaves or not, especially in dry climates like ours. Plants need to be able to replenish their water stores, and this is why you often see dieback on the tips of deciduous plants and trees and significant dieback on evergreens. So get out there, water your evergreens, water your plants, and water anything, especially that you just planted new. I know it's tough because it's cold, and typically, obviously our sprinklers are not working, but it's really necessary. And this is what happens in the state of Utah a lot of the time with the dieback in the evergreens. It's because of a lack of water in winter.
And that's your Gardening Utah tip of the week, brought to you by The Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit utahadvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Okay, listen up, everybody. This show today is so fun and so funny. I had such a blast with Cameron Allcott from Progressive Plants and horticulturist Liz Hamilton with this show. I'm telling you what, we were laughing. So here's what you're going to learn today. We myth busted a whole bunch of different things that are really popular on the internet with regard to plant advice. Everything from whether or not you should put Epsom salt in the ground when you plant your tomatoes, all the way to whether you plant a banana peel with your roses. Liz Hamilton and Cameron are going to get into all of that, and we're going to debunk all of these garden myths to give you guys the truth. So why don't we get right after it right now? Here is Cameron Allcott and Liz Hamilton. You guys, I love having you here. Let's get started. All right, guys. So let's start with one of the things we hear a lot of, which is Epsom salt. It sounds like there's a lot of different myths around Epsom salt. So let's hear it. What's the first one that comes to mind?
Yeah, the one that I hear a lot is, the Epsom salt adding magnesium to the soil, which, yes, but we also live in Utah, where there's a lot of magnesium already in our soil. So it's just one of those things that you're just kind of like adding to something that we already have an abundance of, and then sometimes making, or causing magnesium toxicity. Just by, being kind of ignorant of what's already in your soil. And I know Liz comes across it quite a bit because people ask you all sorts of crazy questions about Epsom salts.
Yeah, I think on a lot of gardening sites, it can be touted as like a cure-all, right? Like, oh, your tomatoes are suffering, add some magnesium. Oh, you have blossom end rot, add some magnesium. Oh, your blossoms aren't setting, add some magnesium. And really, if you can overdo it, magnesium toxicity is a thing. The other thing to consider is that, it's a salt. And so people will say, well, yeah, but it's not table salt. But salt is a chemical formulation. Salt isn't one thing. A salt is a type of formulation. And so salts can build up in the soil, but they don't necessarily have to be sodium salts. They can be magnesium salts, or they can be something else. And so you can end up with these higher levels of things that your plants can't process, or if you really overuse it, or throw in a handful, like when you plant your plants, and then your plants will get big. Magnesium is important to plant development. It's not nothing, but it's also possible to really overdo it. And it's not necessarily something that your plant has to have. You can get the same boosts from other products that are less intense, as it were, and in different formulations, so that you're not looking at all the problems that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think that the chemical composition of soil is really very complex, and a lot has to go into it. You can still have, high magnesium, but if the plant doesn't tolerate the higher pHs that we have here, it's going to have some uptake problems as well. Additionally, if your moisture level is too high or too low, that's also going to impact, nutrient uptake. It's not there's never just a simple fix when it comes to plants. You have to really understand the entire gamut of what is going on in order to make educated decisions. So a lot of the anecdotal stuff that you read on the internet doesn't necessarily work, or sometimes correlation is not causation. I think we see that a lot.
Isn't that the truth, Cameron? There are no simple fixes, and you really do need to understand kind of the whole ecosystem. And I'm writing this down, and I'm never going to forget it because I love this. Correlation is not causation. Anyway, we need to jump to a quick break, but when we come back, Liz and Cameron and we're going to talk about myth number 2, which is blossom end rot and eggshells and more. Stay with us right here on Gardening Utah.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Probably Liz's favorite subject is blossom end rot and calcium.
And now myth number 2.
So I think and usually when I try to have this conversation with people that are, well, I put eggshells in my soil and everything fixed itself. Or last year I had blossom end rot and then I buried an egg or eggshells with my plant this year when I planted them, and I didn't get blossom end rot. But the things you have to remember is the science doesn't always back that. We know that calcium in eggshells is not in a soluble form. Plants cannot take it up. And in our high pH soils, something to think about is that even if they break down over time, Our high pH soils still don't break them down into something that's very soluble. If you were in an acidic soil area, like a 4.5 or so, the breakdown, the chemical reaction that does happen does break it down into something more soluble. But that's not us, and it doesn't apply to us. You can do things like bake them, and then grind them, and then wet them in vinegar, and then put them in your soil, and that may help. But at that point, why don't you just buy calcium sulfate? What was the point of that? So for me, it's not always okay, maybe after hours of brewing some sort of witch's concoction in your kitchen, you managed to create a soluble calcium, which was awesome, but you could have gone out to the store and just bought some. And at that point, the cost of the eggs that you had versus the whole process maybe wasn't worth it. And in the meantime, most people don't even know they have to process it. So they'll say things like, at the beginning of my ramble here was, okay, so I planted an eggshell and last year it didn't work. I had blossom end rot and this year I don't, and that's what it is. But what you have to understand, and what's scientifically understood, is that what triggers blossom end rot is a hormone in the plant, and that's gibberellins. And so gibberellins are triggered by many things. So one of them could be cold. One of them is heat stress. One of them is a drought. And so these things can trigger blossom end rot and have nothing to do with what's going on in soil. Utah has highly calcareous soils. We have lots of calcium, but if you don't water enough, calcium is a heavy mineral to move and it doesn't go through the plant. And so your plant is showing a calcium deficiency when it's buried in a calcareous soil. Or if if it's really hot and you were watering fine at the beginning of the season, in June, it doesn't necessarily equate to the same amount of water for a larger plant and a bigger root system that you have in August. And so then all of a sudden in August, you're showing blossom end rot. And I say, it's a watering issue. And you say, I've been watering the same all year and this just started. Why isn't it fixing itself?
Because watering the same all year is the problem.
Right. And so there are other issues going on here. So an example would be, I plant my plant too early. I trigger a gibberellin response because there's a late frost. My plant doesn't die, but that gibberellin response has been triggered. My plant sets fruit a month later, but it's setting flowers. It's doing these things as that gibberellin response has happened in the plant. And my plant sets blossom end rot fruit. And then I go and bury a bunch of eggshells at the bottom. I water heavily. And I say a month later, the plant has rectified itself. That gibberellin has moved out of its system, no longer has that issue going on. The plant can now form fruit correctly the way it's supposed to. And you say, look, I planted eggshells at the base and it totally cured my issue. But that didn't cure anything. It was a correlation. You planted eggshells, but also the plant had time to recover. Or you see it at the end of the season where I was watering, everything was fine. I buried eggshells because someone told me that would correct the issue. And then here we are a month later and everything's fine and it's working again. Well, okay, but you watered fine in June, you watered fine in July, you hit August, it was a drought, it was really hot. We triggered all these gibberellins because not enough water and too much heat. I had blossom end rot for a month. I buried some eggshells. And then it's September and the temperatures drop. And my water is now sufficient again, and everything, and my fruit is setting heavily, and the plant has rectified the issue. We've moved the gibberellin out of its system, and now I'm setting fruit normally again. Sure, you planted eggshells, but we know that the eggshells aren't soluble, especially not in one season, especially if you didn't do anything like your witch's brew in your living room, so whatever you're doing. So it can't be the eggshells, even though you did that. So that's kind of one of those things that these things rectify themselves and you have issues that occur over time during the season, but that doesn't mean something you did necessarily fixed the issue. It is just the life cycle of that plant expressing the hormones that it has triggered over different stressful periods of its life.
Absolutely.
And so there's those things. So the myth of eggshells is a big one. And you'll see lots of people say, well, I did this and it fixed itself. Or my grandpa grew tomatoes for 25 years and we always put eggshells in and we never had blossom end rot. Well, that's great. But if your grandpa grew tomatoes for 25 years and never had blossom end rot, it's because he knew what he was doing. And the eggshells was probably not necessary, but a really great way to add organic matter back into your soil. But you would have had great tomatoes because your grandpa's a great farmer. Doesn't necessarily mean the eggshells had anything to do with it. So, you know,
so
little things
true.
like that.
I feel like I need a bell. Myth number 1 busted. Bing!
Now, do you have anything to add to that, Cameron?
No, not really. I mean, I think you covered that subject very well. I mean, Liz, you know, we're moderators of the Utah Gardeners Facebook page, and Liz wrote that basically that explanation, like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now. And basically between the beginning of May and then August, actually both of us pretty much copy and paste the link to that explanation for every time that somebody's asking questions about their tomatoes and why they're having problems.
Yeah. And now what we can do is we can keep the link to this episode and say, if you'd like to listen to Liz, if you prefer learning with audio, you can listen to Liz talk about this here.
Just time stamp it into things. So
there you go. Exactly. Yeah. Well, one quick question along those lines, because I know people will be wondering this. When you do notice that your tomato does have blossom end rot, as your tomato's ripening and you can see the bottom, which starts to look a little bit brown and it gets worse as it grows. I mean, sometimes you can let it grow and cut off the bottom if you want, but what do you suggest to do when you notice for the first time that some of the tomatoes have blossom end rot?
Like in terms of trying to stop it in its tracks and save that specific fruit, or just the plant in general?
No, just the specific fruit. Like, is it best to just get rid of it off the plant and not make the fruit put energy, or the plant put energy into ripening those fruits?
That's up to you. Because if you're going to cut it off and eat it, then let the plant spend its energy on that fruit. But if you notice it and you're not going to eat it because it grosses you out, then rip it off the plant and send the plant have the plant put its energy into newer fruit. There's really, like, once that process has started, there's really not much you can do about it. It indicates a production of gibberellins, potentially a lack of calcium, because they kind of both interplay there, which could be due to watering, could be due to other things. Too much heat can cause it because of the gibberellin response and the potential lack of uptake of the calcium because it's a heavy mineral. Calcium specifically is used by plants in cell wall formation. So that's why you see that rotting when there's not, and you see it in the end because the plant has pushed that calcium all the way through. It gets into the fruit and then the tops are okay, but it doesn't push it into that like axial bottom bud there. And that's where you begin to see that rot because the plant can't form cell walls that don't rot. Does that make sense?
Totally.
For me, I've actually shifted my tomato planting to later in the spring. So I don't have to deal with a lot of that because, I mean, the last couple of years, it seems like we got like these really cold spells like early in May because I know everybody wants to plant their warm season crops around Mother's Day. I've kind of shifted that myself over towards like closer to Memorial Day. And, you know, because what a lot of people don't understand is that like in greenhouse production for tomato plants, like we're growing them at like 75 degrees. And then we're not really ever at 75 degrees around Memorial Day. So you're taking them from like a greenhouse, sticking them outside, buying them, and then, you know, you're still having cold temperatures of like, you know, 45 to 55 at night. And that's going to freak tomatoes out. That's where you're going to get, you know, those hormone productions that Liz is talking about. So I would always wait until the nighttime temperatures are really only about 60 to 65. And then it's, you know, you're a lot less likely to get a whole lot of blossom end rot at that point. So I'm totally killing the tomato industry at this point for the local nurseries. Sorry.
He's going professional.
That's just what I've done.
You know, and something else to think
about. I also don't
is,
grow tomatoes for the general public, so I'm not as concerned about it.
There's something else to think about too, is that the susceptibility to, you know, how they respond to that lack of calcium or that gibberellin response is also varietal as well. Like how they deal with it is also genetics. And so something you'll see quite commonly is blossom end rot in like Roma types, so San Marzanos, Romas, white sausage is another type there. It's an heirloom variety. So those ones, and because the thought process is, and there's actually a scientific paper on this that I read a week ago. I don't know why I was reading it, but I was. And it's from 2014. It's really fascinating, but they're talking about how they did all these studies where the top of the plant had all the nutrients it needed, but for whatever reason, certain varieties can't push unless they're heavily watered or in ideal conditions, can't push the nutrients the fruit needs down to the bottom of that final axial bud. And so knowing this, and that's usually where you see the most issues, like almost always when I see blossom end rot, it's either heirloom varieties, and they're heirloom varieties for a reason, right? They don't produce as well on like a mass scale, and also a lot of them don't keep very well, and then they also struggle with certain abiotic and biotic disorders, one of which is blossom end rot. And so you see them a lot in heirloom type tomatoes, and then you see it almost always in any Roma types, unless people are really on it with the watering.
Got it.
So things you can do to try and like stop it in its tracks is up your watering. That's like number one. You're probably not watering often enough, especially if it seemed fine and then it got a lot hotter. Like, and people will say, well, my plants aren't wilting. And I'm like, that's fine, but that's not about whether they wilt or not. It's about whether or not they have enough.
Liz, you're a genius. Can I just tell you this right now? Okay, we're going to go to a quick break, and we'll be right back with actually more tips on how to prevent blossom end rot. And Liz is going to tell us the tomato that never gets blossom end rot. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me here is two actual geniuses in the land of horticulture and landscape. So I have Cameron Allcott with Progressive Plants and horticulturist Liz Hamilton. And Liz, right before the break, you were telling us a few ways that you can prevent blossom end rot in your tomatoes. And we were debunking the myth all about Epsom salt and eggshell when you plant your tomato. But remind us what you were saying about when your plant is, when you think the plant is getting enough water.
People will say, well, my plants aren't wilting. And I'm like, that's fine, but that's not about whether they wilt or not. It's about whether or not they have enough water to push the nutrients where they need to go. And if you've triggered that gibberellin response by not having enough water, like they wilt during the day and then they're fine in the afternoon when they hit a little shade, then that's an issue as well. At some point, that plant has lost turgidity and it's not getting enough water. And that's something else to think about as well. Especially if you're seeing that blossom end rot, that's a pretty straightforward indicator. Knowing that you have a susceptible variety also makes it easier to know how to treat them or to expect certain things. Like sometimes if I plant out too early, I just assume that I will have blossom end rot sometimes. If it's a drought and it's really hot outside, I'll get blossom end rots. That's why you never really see it in cherry tomatoes. In cherry tomatoes, the fruit's very small, so the plant can push that stuff around. And even with a gibberellin response, the plant's still receiving. The fruit is still receiving the nutrients it needs.
That makes so much sense. I don't think I've ever seen blossom end rot in cherry tomato, ever.
It's because they're small. Mm-hmm.
Science! Okay, so we talked about Epsom salt, a little bit about eggshells, but there's another myth related to eggshells that I wanted to see if you could squash, no pun intended, with regard to snails. A lot of people think that if you line your garden bed with eggshells, that it can stop snails. Give us the real scoop on that.
It doesn't.
I think I saw something posted the other day about these like penny balls, like copper was a deterrent for snails and slugs. I'm like,
well, copper does. I mean, copper will, but if you put like a penny in the back of your garden, it's not going to stop the snail from eating the lettuce in the front of your garden. Like it has to cross that barrier. And if there's no barrier to cross, there's no reason for the snail to be concerned about copper somewhere else.
Right.
So with the eggshells, there is Robert Pavlis, is a guy that wrote several garden myth busting books. He's a horticulturalist up in Canada. He's in Vancouver somewhere, and he's kind of famous for that kind of stuff. And he has a Facebook page called Garden Fundamentals that he runs, which is often like a junk show because it has an international following. And for that reason, it's like, how do you even get all the information out to everyone who needs it? Like, if you're in Canada, I'm not sure how you're offering like awesome advice to somebody in like Africa, but they try. Everybody tries.
Yeah.
So, but he does have some really fun things that he does. And one of the things he does is he tries different things and has like video and YouTube blogs and things like that. And so he has these really fun videos of him taking all these eggshells and crushing them and like placing them around plants very carefully, making a full barrier to make sure that these slugs and snails can't touch his stuff. And he puts them on a nighttime time lapse with a light, and his slugs and snails are just crossing the barrier and eating all of his plants down to nubs. It's hilarious. Like, clearly doesn't work. And I think one of the things, what I hear associated with that is the sharp edge of the shells cuts open the body of the slug or snail and they bleed out to death. And I just want people, when they think about that, to question why a slug or a snail that spends its entire life mostly crawling around on rocks and the ground and everything else would all of a sudden hit. I mean, okay, it's sharp, but it's not like glass, which you can watch them crawl across broken glass. They are fine.
Yeah.
Why would it hit a sharp edge of that's like a bad biological evolutionary design, right? Like, I said something sharp, I'm dead now. Like, that doesn't that doesn't make any sense. So I don't really know how that myth got started, but and then people will say, well, I had slugs and then I put down all these other things and then the slugs went away. And I mean, like, okay, but slugs are also seasonal. They're not always there. And I mean, I can't know why everything works and why it doesn't work, but there's video proof out there that completely debunks the eggshell thing. And I mean, obviously it also just, I think, doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I've observed along those lines is that, let's say, hypothetically speaking, and by the way, I've done this before because I believed the hype, you guys. I took my eggshells from my very own chickens and I crunched them up just in a course, to do exactly what you just said.
To make sure they just die as soon as they touch them.
It seems so ridiculous right now.
I don't know. I just like when people say they'll just die. I'm like, that's not how it works.
Well, to be fair, I didn't think they would die. I just thought they'd turn back around.
No, eggshells, no.
See, in my mind, like, I just kind of imagine like these people, there's like, hey, you know what? We have all these followers on YouTube. Let's give them some really bad advice and then just laugh at them later.
So true. Well, I swear I saw it on YouTube. It was on the internet, so it must be true. Anyway, but when having chickens, they love to go find the itty bitty snails. And so I'll never forget last spring when the hostas are still like little buds, they haven't quite come out yet, because the hostas are where I have the biggest problem with snails. And I had not yet done my little, eggshell path to keep them from going into it. And I realized the chickens are going after the snails in the base of that plant, right? All those snails are hiding all around the base and the dirt and inside any crevice that it can get to. And they're itty bitty. I'm talking about the little babies and all that, and they're hatching right there.
Yeah, they're already there. Like, that's the other thing is, and then if the eggshells did work, then you've just trapped them inside with your hosta.
Exactly.
It's like a feast and you have to stay until it's over.
Exactly.
So I don't know. I think the best thing, not that we're like talking about products on this particular one, but I think the best product out there is Sluggo. It's organic. It's safe. You spread it around, they eat that and they're gone. They die.
Yep.
And that's Or people will spread salt. I mean, that's another like, okay, that might work, but it washes away every time it rains, or in our case, it irrigates, right? If you have overhead sprinklers. And then you're also salting the ground, which
kills everything.
Not a great. I mean, if you're doing it regularly around your hosta, that isn't going to like it anyway. It's not the best choice.
Right. Absolutely. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Okay, so we've talked about Epsom salts and eggshells. Now let's get on to bananas. And two myths with this. One I've seen, in fact, I just saw a TikTok of it yesterday, and he's talking about peel your bananas after you eat your banana, put the peel in some water and let it ferment for 5 days, and then water all of your plants. And then I've also seen to, of course, this is, my grandmother wouldn't even tell me you've got to bury a banana when you bury your roses. So let's hit that one.
Well, I've heard bury a fish head when you bury your roses. That's
I've heard that too, actually.
Or with your tomatoes, bury a fish head with your tomatoes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, okay, so if you're burying a banana peel or a fish head or whatever, I mean, it will eventually compost and be food. But I don't know that you're getting any like extra potassium for that plant, which is great. I mean, I think so. Okay. So let's say you're burying the banana or using banana juice that you've made, whatever that means, to get potassium to get blooms. Okay. So if you're planting your banana or you're planting your rose with the banana, probably unlikely that the rose is going to do much blooming in that first year anyway, and it's going to biodegrade over time anyway. And so I think that any perceived higher levels of potassium that would be there would be gone by the time that plant is really utilizing it. So it doesn't really seem like, I mean, I don't know that I have any specific studies or anything like that, but just in terms of logistics, it doesn't seem like it would really make a difference one way or another. You could put an NPK fertilizer on it and probably have a higher dose of potassium if the plant even needed it in their first year. Like some roses don't even do that. And then as far as like letting it ferment for several days, there's some evidence out there, because then you're getting into the myth potentially of compost teas, right? We ferment our comfrey, we ferment our cow poop, we do these things, and then we boil it all together, and then we pour it on our plants. And there is some evidence out there, that these things do actually some of the stuff that they're purported to do. Like a lot of people use compost tea actually as an insecticide and not as a fertilizer. I don't know if you've heard that, but you make a compost tea and you spray it on your roses and then it prevents black spot. And which is fungal, sometimes bacterial, depending on which black spot you have specifically, but there is some evidence out there that it does prevent those things. Replication has been not 100% in terms of that experiment, but they have been done, and there has been some evidence out there that does work as an organic option for certain fungal infections. But in terms of like making any compost teas as a fertilizer, at that point, I mean, if you were to measure those things, I think the NPK in that would be pretty much negligible. It's always good to water your plants. Any NPK is going to be beneficial, but like if you're at a 1-1-1 or like a 0-1-1 or something like that, like what was the point of keeping a stinky banana in your garage for 5 days while you let it ferment?
Exactly.
Not great. Yeah. The other thing I have heard is that if you do these things and you make these compost teas, and you can buy like aerobic boilers for these things. Have you seen those on the interwebs? Like you can buy a boiler for your compost tea and you aerate it and let it like boil for a couple of days. And what that is supposed to do and which it may do, is create like a bacterial colony, like lots of good bacteria in there. And so that when you put it on the garden, you're introducing lots of like beneficial microbes. But I think what people don't always understand is that, like most bacteria and fungus and protozoa and things like that, they're environmental specific. So things that are living and growing in your brew compost tea that you've got going on in your backyard, as soon as you end up pouring them onto the ground, they're probably going to die. Yeah. They're probably not going to make it because they're not sitting around in their compost sludge getting aerated, over and over and over again in their fermenting whatever. Sugars are happening, bacteria are eating them. We're building a colony, sure, but it's a colony that lives in your compost tea mess, not the garden, not the soil, not in that same environment. Now, you could argue that all these dead protozoa and dead bacteria that ultimately won't make it within an hour after you pour it all out into the garden is fertilizer. There's that. I mean, maybe there's a benefit there, and I don't know that that's been studied, but again, like, you're not making this amazing brew that's going to end up on the soil that's going to like do these things for your plants, because everything you brewed up is going to die when it hits the soil.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, along those lines, speaking of hitting the soil, coffee grounds. We hear that all the time. Mix them into the soil. It'll impact your pH.
No, yeah. It doesn't. No, it doesn't.
There's also you can tie in with that the myth of pine needles as well. Coffee grounds and pine needles. Put the pine bark mulch and the pine needles and the coffee grounds, and then you'll have acidic soil, or you'll change the pH. And I will just say, we are an average in Utah. Our pH is about 7.0 at most places in the valley. Some places it's a little higher, some places a little lower, but 7.0 is the average, which puts us on the high side. And anything above that is higher and higher. And I actually came up with this on my own to explain it to people. I didn't read this anywhere. I feel excited about this analogy. But when you go and you add like sulfur or any of these things like elemental sulfur that are proven to lower pH on certain things, and you scatter it around your plants and stuff like that, it's like adding a few drops of fresh water into the ocean and expecting to get a glass of fresh water. It's never going to happen, because we are an ocean of high pH. And if you amend and you amend and you amend and you amend in a yard that is all high pH, maybe if you're lucky in like that little square foot area, you can get the pH to lower a little bit over time. But we water with high pH water. We already have a high pH soil. Like, you're not going to amend your way down in your tiny postage stamped yard or your tiny one garden bed down to an acceptable level for something that needs an acidic soil. The exception to that would be if you had like a raised bed that's separated from everything else, and you can put things in there that is just high pH. But again, you're going to end up watering, or low pH, but again, you're going to end up watering it with high pH soil. So over time, it will eventually strip that acidity out, and you'll need to continue amending even in raised bed situations over time to correct the issue. So that being said, back to coffee grounds and pine needles. Pine needles have if they are green and they fall off the tree green, they actually have an acidity, if I remember correctly, of 3.0. It's high, very high, or low, I guess you would say low, very high acidity. I believe, if I remember correctly from what I was reading, and of course different species are going to be different, but the pinus that was used for that particular sample in a study that I was looking at, the fresh green, they're actually 3.0, which is very low or very high acidity, however you want, low pH, high acidity, however you want to look at that. And so, but once they fall off the tree, or the tree gets mowed down and crushed up, they die. And the acidity of dead needles that are no longer attached to anything, or dead bark, or dead arborist chips, is a neutral, actually. It's not acidic at all. So it's a 6.0. It's right in there. And so if you're anticipating a 3 because you're trying to lower your acidity levels, it's actually a 6. Maybe it's a 3 right at, if you like get a super fresh tree and you're grinding them right into your soil, but it's not staying. It's going to degrade down to a 6. And so then you're looking at a neutral. So then you're just trying to lower 1 pH below. And then when you're constantly already watering with a high pH water and you're stripping that soil out, pine isn't really doing anything for you. And then people will say, well, I thought plants didn't live under pine trees because they have high acidity under the soil from years of pine needle drop, which is another myth. If you take samples of dirt that are under pine trees, they're actually not acidic. What reason why most things don't grow under pine trees is because they have an evergreen canopy that's year round. That's really dense depending on the tree that you are working with, and it blocks light. So already off the bat, you have a really low light situation. And the other thing is pines and conifers in general don't actually develop a taproot. There's no gigantic taproot that goes into the ground that's anchoring that tree into place. So what you have is a very fine network of feeder roots and surface roots. And I think if I've read correctly, it's like 2 feet and up is the root system. Have you ever tried to dig under a really well-established pine tree? It's impossible, right? Like the dirt's hard, there's roots everywhere. And then imagine, if you've ever seen it, when like a blue spruce is picked up by the wind and turned over and falls down. Yeah. Is there a giant taproot? Is there like an old stump that's there on the ground? Or is it just come up in a giant disc and then sit there? It's a disc because that's where the roots are. So you have these feeder roots that are competing for water, and there is no sunlight. So there's not a lot of water falling through these dense canopies either. So there's not much water underneath there. There's no sunlight. And then what little water does get through, that tree is scrounging for it in the top 2 feet of soil all the way around it. And so it's really just not an ideal place to plant plants anyway, unless you're planning to water really heavily, which you can do, and you can see things thrive there. I have seen beautiful gardens under conifers, but there's usually either it's in a high humidity area or it's in a place where somebody is dumping a lot of water into that garden space. Yeah. So it's not the acidity. Soil tests have shown us over and over again that they're not acidic under that in non-acidic areas. So, and then the other one is coffee grounds, right? And we were kind of touching on that. And so used coffee grounds, again, after they've been boiled and leached into your coffee, are at a 6. They're neutral. They're not at a high acidic pH. And of course, there are variables, right? Like, did you run a full pot of coffee that day? Maybe there's still some acidity left in there. And did you, like how, I don't know. There's things like that. You can water with coffee. Yeah. And you could use non-used coffee grounds that might provide some kind of upper acidity level. I do take my used coffee grounds and put them, I have a raised bed that is full of peat moss and vermiculite and nothing else. And I grow blueberries in those raised beds. Right. And I've been pretty successful with those blueberries. But I amend every single year with elemental sulfur, and I water with acidifying water once a week when they're actively growing. So I am continuously amending with that. And then I mulch every year with shredded leaves, which can help with acidity, and with more peat. So I bury more peat on top of that. So what's percolating down is still acidic. Peat has a resting acidity of 4. Okay. So peat is highly acidic. Yeah. And so, I amend in other ways, but coffee grounds are a great source of organic material. They're good to add to your compost. It's not necessarily a negative thing. And my thought process is, even though there is zero science to back this up, and it's just a professional, thing that I do, or non-professional thing that I do, I should say, is I take those coffee grounds and I do layer them out on top of the soil in between my peat and things like that, because my thought process is that if there is any coffee left in there that didn't get brewed out, then it's percolating down into my garden beds, which might be acidic. Maybe it's not. And if nothing else, if there's zero acidity and there's nothing to it, then at least I've added organic matter back into the soil, and that's fine too.
Yeah. And the reality is it's not going to hurt anything.
Right. Like there's probably nothing to it. Studies have shown used coffee grounds is 6.0, but like, who studied every piece of used coffee ground? I don't know. I'm going to contradict all the science that I purport on other things, but my thought process is that it won't hurt anything. But I will say they have done some studies that suggest that coffee grounds are actually phytotoxic, meaning they are toxic to plants and can cause cell death, because they do have other things in there like caffeine, and caffeine can be toxic to plant roots. And so depending on the type of plant you're planting, and if you're putting those hot coffee grounds, not literally hot, but like fresh that's what I mean by hot. You're putting those hot coffee grounds like up against the base of little baby plants, and they're potentially susceptible to caffeine burn or caffeine toxicity, then you've done it a disservice. So when I do spread coffee grounds only in this one spot in my garden, I don't spread them close to the plant. I kind of spread it evenly out around. I'm not like dumping my carafe of coffee onto the plant.
Yeah.
I'm spreading in between in the hopes that if there is any issue there, it's dissipating any type of toxicity that might be there.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for being on today's episode of Gardening Utah. Cameron had to jump out on us for a meeting, but as always, you guys are amazing guests, and you do so much for us here at Gardening Utah, as well as you're so amazing to respond to so many Utahns' questions about gardening on the Utah Gardeners Facebook group. So you guys give so much of your free time for really no other reason than just to educate and inform and inspire. So that is just so appreciated. If I could speak on behalf of the 16,000 members of the Utah Gardens Facebook page, or whatever we're at right now. Anyway, if you are listening to this episode and you're thinking to yourself, well, I have an expertise and I'd really love Jana to interview me on this show, send me a DM. Go to Instagram and send me a message. Our handle is @GardeningUtah, obvi, and send me a little message and let me know, tell me about yourself, and let's see if we could have you on a future show. As well as if you're a listener and you would like me to interview an expert that you know of, or I haven't tackled a topic that you're really interested in, send me a DM. I love to hear from our listeners and tell me what you think about the show. And speaking of, if you are listening to this on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, I would absolutely love it if you would do two things. One, I would love it if you would subscribe if you haven't already, because you will always be notified when we drop new episodes. And two, I would love you to give us a 5-star rating. I'm just going to be humble about it and tell you straight up. We would love your 5-star ratings and reviews, because that is what helps us stick around and get found in Apple Podcast and in Spotify. Anyway, I love to read 5-star ratings on the show, so give us some love and we'll give it right back, and you'll hear your name on the radio and in the podcast. Oh, shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week right here on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
We are supported by ProgressivePlants.com. ProgressivePlants.com. They are your neighbors next door and experts at helping you choose the perfect and unique plants that will thrive in your location. Progressive Plants is passionate about helping homeowners, expert gardeners, novices alike choose the correct plant for your soil. They don't just grow plants, they know plants. Let Progressive Plants help you today. Just go to ProgressivePlants.com and check out their wide selection. You can also go to the Design tab and look at the expert designers that they have that can help you plan your perfect yard. Visit ProgressivePlants.com today.